Good morning. We are on the record. The date is September 28th, 2022. The time now is 10:01 a.m. Marking the start of the deposition of Katerina Blazek in the matter of Sue Puri versus Encompass Insurance Company. This is the underinsured motorist arbitration, and we're located on Zoom conference room. My name is Dan Gavern on behalf of American Legal Video Solutions. I'm not financially interested in this action, nor am I a relative or employee of any of the attorneys or any of the parties. I've been retained by counsel for the claimant, Don Roach. Could all counsel please present themselves, your affiliations, and then the court board will administer the oath.
Thank you, Dan. John Roach for the claimant, Sue Puri.
Melissa Barcina on behalf of the respondent, Encompass Insurance Company.
Blazek, could you raise your hand, please? Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Good morning. Can you tell the arbitrator your name?
Sure. My name is Katerina Blazek.
Thank you. Dr. Blazek, what's your profession?
I am a consulting engineer. I consult in the areas of accident reconstruction and biomechanics.
And what is your role in this case?
In this particular case, I have been retained by counsel for Ms. Puri to provide my opinions in the areas of accident reconstruction and biomechanics regarding this particular accident.
And are you ready to tell the arbitrator all your opinions regarding accident reconstruction and biomechanics today?
Yes.
Wonderful. Have you ever testified for me before in a deposition, arbitration, or trial?
I have not.
When did you first start studying? Well, let me ask a better question. Where did you first study mechanical engineering?
I first began studying mechanical engineering in my undergraduate institution, which is the Olin College of Engineering.
And did you go on to continue your studies in mechanical engineering?
Yes, I have a bachelor's in mechanical engineering from Olin, and then I have a master's also in mechanical engineering from Stanford University, as well as a Ph.D. in mechanical engineering also from Stanford.
Thank you. And did you study biomechanics and accident reconstruction as part of your studies of mechanical engineering?
So the foundations for accident reconstruction, namely the physics and the engineering, were covered in both my undergraduate and graduate curriculum. And then my biomechanics was the specialization that I focused on in graduate school for both my master's and my PhD.
Where do you currently work?
I currently work for Insightech.
What sort of work do you do for Insightech?
The vast majority of my time is spent providing consulting services in the litigation context, either matters that are already in litigation or that are anticipated to be in litigation.
When you are testifying in a legal setting, what percentage of your work is on behalf of an injured party, whether a plaintiff or a claimant, versus a defendant, or in this matter, a respondent?
As of right now, the retentions for me are approximately 25% counsel for the claimant or the plaintiff, and about 75% counsel for the defendant or the respondent.
Thank you. And when you're not doing medical legal work at Insightech, what other work do you do at Insightech? I believe it's around 5% is not medical legal.
So the rest of my time at Insightech, I typically do other scientific work, namely reviewing papers for biomechanics journals.
Thank you. Did you perform an independent analysis of the Puri collision that took place on August 30th, 2016?
Yes.
What materials did you review?
For this particular case, I reviewed the traffic collision report that pertains to this particular collision. I reviewed repair estimates for Ms. Puri's vehicle. I saw photographs of Ms. Piri's vehicle, as well as one photograph of the vehicle that struck her, the Toyota 4Runner. I reviewed the depositions of Ms. Piri and her husband, as well as Dr. Doherty, expert for the respondent. And then I reviewed medical records for Ms. Piri, as well as several reports that were authored by physicians or medical professionals, both retained by the plaintiff or by the respondent, as well as by the claimant.
Okay. And
I think I
I'm
also
sorry.
reviewed her discovery responses, Ms. Piri's discovery responses.
Okay. And you're not here to give any medical opinions, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Where did the collision happen?
This collision occurred in Novato at the northbound 101 exit for Nave Drive.
What vehicles were involved in the collision?
The two vehicles that we know for sure were involved were Ms. Piri's 2008 Mercedes S63, which was the car at the very front. And then we have Ms. Lopez's 2001 Toyota 4Runner, which was the vehicle that, the vehicle that struck Ms. Piri's Mercedes. There's also some indication in the police report that Ms. Lopez says that there was a third vehicle that struck her, but we have no information about that aside from her saying that there was one.
Okay. And did the police report ultimately conclude that there was really no evidence of a third vehicle?
That's correct. I've treated this as a two-car rear-end collision because we have no evidence that there was a third car that was involved.
Did Miss Piri's Mercedes have a passenger?
Correct. Ms. Piri's 17-year-old son, Kobe, was in the front passenger seat.
Did the Toyota have a passenger?
Yes, Ms. Lopez's son, Brayley, was in the vehicle. I'm not sure which seat he was in, but probably in the back, given that he was 4 years old at the time.
And did you take into account the weights of the occupant and passenger in determining the speeds involved in this collision?
Correct. So as part of my analysis, I performed what's called a linear momentum and crush analysis, which as one of the inputs takes the weights of the vehicles involved, which includes the weights of the vehicles themselves or their curb weight, plus the weights of all the occupants inside each vehicle.
Did you review a photograph showing damage behind Miss Piri's bumper?
I reviewed a photograph showing that there was damage to the bumper support bar, which is the metal beam that is the structural portion of her rear bumper. There was also indication in the repair estimate that that was replaced.
Did you determine the speeds of the vehicles at the time of impact?
I did, yes.
What were the speeds?
So the speed for Ms. Piri's vehicle was 0 miles an hour. She testified that she was at a full stop at the time that she was struck. The speed of the Toyota 4Runner ranged from 11 to 14 miles an hour.
How did you determine that the Toyota was traveling from 11 to 14 miles per hour when it struck Miss Piri's Mercedes?
This is part of the crush momentum analysis. So first, I took the photographs that I had of both vehicles, as well as the repair estimates indicating the portions of the vehicles that were repaired. I then took values from the literature for the stiffnesses of the front of the Toyota and the rear of the Mercedes. And I then calculated the total energy absorbed in the damage due to this collision that was shown in the photographs. Once I have the total amount of energy absorbed, I used a linear momentum model to calculate what the speeds would have to be for the two vehicles in order to create the amount of energy that we absorb that we see in the damage.
Now, those materials that you relied on, is that customary in biomechanics to rely on that sort of studies and information?
Yes, the crush momentum analysis or the crush model combined with a linear momentum analysis is something that is well accepted in the reconstruction and biomechanics literature as being a method of analyzing the type of collision that we have here, which is an inline rear end collision.
What is a delta V?
A delta V is a term that we use in reconstruction and biomechanics to characterize the severity of a collision. Technically speaking, it's the change in speed of a vehicle that occurs during the course of a collision. So for example, if you're driving along the highway at 60 miles an hour and you were to hit a wall and then you were going 0 miles an hour, during the course of that collision, you would experience a reduction in speed of 60 miles an hour or a delta V of 60 miles an hour. And the reason why we use this is because it allows us to compare different types of collisions or different information about collisions to try and understand how severe a particular accident might be. So for example, if we can calculate the delta V of a particular accident, we can then look at the literature to tell us what might be the forces or accelerations on a person for an accident of a similar severity based on some testing that's been done.
Did you determine a range for the delta V for Miss Peary's Mercedes?
Yes, the vehicle that Miss Peary was in, her Mercedes, experienced a delta V of about 5.5 to 7 miles per hour.
And how did you determine that range? Can you walk us through your analysis?
Sure. So first, I determined the amount of crush absorbed or the amount of energy absorbed in the crush of the back of her vehicle and the front of the Toyota. And here I have a low estimate of about 1 inch on the front of the Toyota and the back of the Mercedes, up to about 1 inch of crush on the back of the Mercedes and 2 inches of crush on the front of the Toyota. And this is my high and my low, or the low and the high estimates. Using that crush energy, I then plugged it into the linear momentum model, taking the weights of the two vehicles, as well as the crush energy absorbed, and I calculated what the delta V's would be, as well as what the impact speed would be.
And is that range 5.5 to 7 delta V for the Mercedes similar to the range determined by the respondent's expert, Brian Doherty?
Yes, I believe his range was about 6 to 7 miles per hour. So his range is encompassed within the range that I have.
Okay. Did you determine the peak head acceleration for Miss Peary's head?
Yes, so this is an area where we can compare our accident to what's published in the literature. And what has been shown through testing with anthropomorphic dummies is that in rear-end accidents like this, the struck vehicle, the occupant, especially the driver, will initially move backwards relative to the vehicle. Their torso will load the seat back and their head will strike the headrest. The head acceleration upon that head strike has been measured to be about 2 to 3 times the delta V expressed in miles per hour. So in this particular case, given the delta V for Miss Peary's vehicle, we would expect that her head acceleration would be about 12 to 20 Gs, given the severity of the collision for her.
Did Miss Peary's head strike the headrest in the collision?
Yes, she testified that it did. And given this type of collision and the severity and the fact that her headrest deployed, all point to her head striking the headrest.
And the peak head acceleration that you determined, 12 to 20 Gs, is that similar to Dr. Doherty's conclusions about peak head acceleration?
Again, it's very similar. Dr. Doherty opined that the head acceleration would be less than 20 Gs. He didn't provide a low end of the range, but in terms of the upper end, we agree.
Now, did Miss Peary's headrest malfunction in the collision?
That is difficult to say. In terms of the functionality of the deployment portion of the headrest, it appears to have functioned as intended in the sense that it deployed in the rear end collision in the way that it should. However, it appears that in terms of being able to be reset after the collision, it did not work as intended, because it's my understanding that resetting the headrest should be something that the dealer can do if you bring your vehicle in. It appears in this particular case that was not possible and they had to replace the headrest itself.
Are there instances in which the deployment of the headrest increases the head acceleration?
Yes, I have some testing that was performed by the IIHS, which is the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. And they perform a variety of tests on vehicles, one of which is testing of the driver's seat in a rear end collision. And I took all of the tests on Mercedes vehicles that are available for that particular seat test. And I looked to see whether there was, or what the head accelerations were that were measured for the peak head accelerations in these tests for all the seats that have been measured. And about half of them had regular headrests or passive headrests, and about half of them had active headrests, similar to Ms. Peary's headrest. And what I found was that for some of the tests, the peak head acceleration for the head was higher with the active headrest than with the passive headrests. For
Did
the
you also,
same
I'm sorry,
severity of tests, all the tests were designed to be of the same severity, about 9.5 mile-an-hour delta V.
were there instances in which the deployment of the headrest decreased the head acceleration?
Yes, in about 4 out of the 6 tests, the head acceleration was lower for the active headrests than for the passive headrests.
Is the roughly 20 Gs or so of head acceleration more than an individual would experience in activities of daily living?
Yes, for Ms. Peary, she described that she goes about her activities. Her job is a relatively sedentary one. She sits in front of a computer. And then for her leisure activities, she describes that she walks and that she does golf. When we look at the literature for the head accelerations for these types of activities, we find that they are much lower than what would be in this accident, on the order of 1G, 2G, 3Gs resultant head accelerations. Even if Ms. Peary was doing more vigorous activities like running or jumping, the head accelerations would still be lower than this particular accident.
Are there studies that discuss whether a woman who is the age and size of Miss Sue Peary cannot suffer a concussion with 12 to 20 Gs of head acceleration?
The answer is no. The biomechanics literature on the head tolerance to concussion, or the threshold for concussion, if you will, that relates head accelerations to risk of concussion, is based on a very specific population, which are college, mostly college and some professional football players. And so that subject population for which we have data is younger, physically larger, and of the opposite gender to Ms. Peary. In terms of somebody similar to Ms. Peary, we have no data that would allow us to tell, that would give us information about what the head tolerance might be of a physically petite 50-year-old woman.
And why can we not test a 50-year-old petite woman's head acceleration in a study?
The way that we would, the reason why we have head tolerance data for football players is because they wear helmets and they are exposed to activities that would result in concussions at least some of the time. And so we can put accelerometers in their helmets and we can let them do what they do, which is play football and practice football. And then over time, we collect the data on their head accelerations, and we also collect data on which players go on to sustain a concussion. This is possible because they have a very specific environment. For someone like Ms. Peary or people of her demographics, we would first need to expose them to activities that could potentially cause a concussion, which would create some real ethical problems. Because unless they voluntarily expose themselves to concussions, it's something that would be unethical for us as researchers to do. And then we would also need to figure out some way to measure their head accelerations all the time so that we would be able to spot the ones that result in a concussion versus don't result in a concussion. And so this is why we just don't have the data. If we had a recreational football league for somebody like Ms. Peary, we might be able to collect that data, but it simply doesn't exist.
So with football players, they're banging their heads anyway, so it's not really exposing them to additional danger. Is that more or less the case?
Exactly. We're taking something that they already do and putting our scientific measurements on top of that. We're not exposing them to any additional risk. They're doing that as part of their either profession or their sports activities anyway. If we were to go out and say, take a group of people, put helmets on them, and then say, well, run around hitting each other on the head to see if we can get concussions, that would not be a very ethical thing for us to do.
Do you agree with Brian Doherty that the amount of force exerted on Miss Peary's head was insufficient to cause a concussion in this case?
I think that analysis is inappropriate because, as we've talked about, the models used to support that statement are based on the football data. And that football data doesn't apply, or it's not applicable to somebody like Ms. Peary. And the answer is we really don't know what kind of a threshold for concussion would apply to somebody like her. We have an inkling that it's very likely to be lower because we know from other areas of biomechanics that the mechanical tolerance of the body decreases with age. For example, bones become less dense and fractures become more common. Ligament tears can occur more readily because things just are mechanically more susceptible with increasing age.
Just to be clear, and this may be belaboring the point, but can the science of biomechanics rule out that Miss Peary sustained a concussion on August 30th, 2016 in the collision?
Asked and answered.
Biomechanics can't tell us one way or the other about whether somebody sustains an injury. That's a medical question. And in this particular case, biomechanics, in my opinion, doesn't even provide us with the information to opine whether there's a mechanism there. Because although we understand what the head acceleration likely was, we don't have the accompanying head tolerance data that would allow us to say whether that head acceleration was higher or lower than some threshold that would apply to Ms. Peary.
And are you aware that the respondent's neurologist, Marilyn Robertson, testified that Miss Peary did sustain some form of concussion in the subject collision?
Yes, that was
State's testimony.
yes, that was a conclusion reached in the report that I reviewed.
And are you aware that the claimant's neurologist, Tracy Newkirk, has given the opinion that Miss Peary sustained a concussion in the collision?
Yes, based on his report, again, that was what was one of the conclusions.
Do you think it'd be more appropriate in determining whether Miss Peary sustained a concussion to look at the clinical symptoms of Miss Peary before and after the collision?
Objection outside of this expert scope of testimony.
In this particular case, I think biomechanics really doesn't offer us an ability to determine what the threshold might be for Ms. Peary. So really the clinical record or the medical evaluation, I think here would take precedence.
Thank you, Dr. Blazek. I have no further questions.
Dr. Blazek, nice to, I will say, see you again. I can see you. You cannot see me. As you may recall, my name is Melissa Barcina, and I represent the respondent in this case. Picking up on your discussion with Mr. Roach just a minute ago, is it your opinion that my biomechanics cannot give you a mechanism of injury as it relates to Ms. Peary in this case?
So yes and no. So the first half of the mechanism of injury, where we can analyze the forces or the acceleration on Ms. Peary's head, biomechanics does provide us with that information. It's the 12 to 20 Gs that we've talked about before. So we have an idea of what kinds of accelerations she sustained during this rear end collision. However, the second half of the mechanism, which is the ability to say whether or not that 20 Gs is consistent with the threshold for concussion, we simply don't have that data for someone like her.
You indicated that peak head acceleration is calculated via testing that is performed. Is that correct on test dummies?
It's not calculated, it's actually measured.
Measured, excuse me. And so based on those measurements, based on the studies that were performed, you've determined that peak head acceleration is 2 to 3 times the delta V. Is that correct?
That's what's published in the literature, yes.
And those studies are IIHS test studies, is that correct?
No, so the IIHS test studies in this particular case, I used for the specific Mercedes seat. You will see that the results are consistent with the 2 to 3 times delta V, but in general, that 2 to 3 times delta V comes from a variety of studies that are mainly published by SAE, which is the Society for Automotive Engineers.
And are those SAE test studies typically utilizing incidents with a delta V of 10 miles per hour?
They range. Typically, the studies will be done at relatively low delta V, and they will provide a range.
And when you say relatively low delta V, what is that?
So the study, for example, that Dr. Doherty, I believe, included in his file, I think the 4 tests that are in that paper range from a delta V of, I think, about 4, then 6, then 8, up to about 12 miles per hour for the struck vehicle.
And so I'll move to strike that as non-responsive. So what is the low delta V that you referred to?
So the 2, the 4, and the 6.
Okay. In regards to your experience, you've never published any work regarding upper extremities injury following a vehicle accident. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you never published any work regarding neck injuries following a motor vehicle accident. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you've never published any work about head injuries following a motor vehicle accident. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you've never personally attended a crash test. Is that correct?
A crash test, no. I've certainly read crash test reports and viewed videos of said crash tests.
Great. And you've never personally witnessed or attended a sled test. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you don't know where Ms. Peary's hands were at the time of impact. Is that correct?
Well, she doesn't know, so I don't know either.
And you don't know where Ms. Peary's legs were located at the time of impact. Is that correct?
Well, one of her feet was on the brake because she was at a stop. Presumably, it was going to be her right foot. Where her left leg was, we can make some assumptions that it was probably somewhere on the floor. But aside from that, that's all I can say.
And in what records did you review that indicated Ms. Peary's right foot was on the brake at the time of impact?
Well, she says that she's at a full and complete stop. And so if you don't have your foot on the brake, typically your vehicle will roll forward under idle speed. So if you want to be at a stop, your foot will have to be on the brake.
Okay, so again, I'll move to strike that as non-responsive. What record indicated to you that Ms. Peary's, that you reviewed in this action, that Ms. Peary's right foot was on the brake at the time of the accident?
Objection asked and answered. Go ahead.
As I mentioned, she testified, that is in her deposition, that she was at a stop. Based on how vehicles behave, that implies that a foot was on the brake. And I'm making the assumption that it's her right foot because that's typically how people drive.
Okay. Did Ms. Puri ever testify at her deposition that her right foot was on the brake at the time of the impact?
I don't believe so.
Did Ms. Puri ever testify at the time of her deposition that her left foot was on the ground at the ground of the vehicle at the time of the impact?
She did not. She wasn't asked, I don't think.
You don't know where Ms. Puri's back was positioned relative to the seat rest at the time of the impact. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, can you ask that again?
Of course. I said you don't know where Ms. Puri's back was positioned at the time of the impact. Is that correct?
Well, again, she's sitting in her driver's seat. She describes being in a seated position and looking at the traffic light in front of her. So while she did not specifically say my back was in a seated position, there's nothing that indicates from her testimony that she was in some abnormal seated position.
Is there anything in Ms. Puri's deposition testimony or any of the records that you review that indicate whether Ms. Puri's back was against the seat back at the time of the impact?
Not one way or the other.
And one way or another, meaning there was no information related to whether her back was away from the seat back at the time of the impact?
Correct. I don't know to what extent all of her back was up against the seat back, or whether some part of it was, or whether she was leaning slightly forward.
And you don't know where Ms. Puri's shoulders were positioned at the time of the impact, is that correct?
Well, again, she's in this, there's no information that she's in some kind of abnormal seated position. So her shoulders are going to be in a regular driving position. How far away they are from the seat back, that we don't know.
Okay. Have you calculated Ms. Puri's pre-incident tolerances for head acceleration?
I have not.
And you didn't inspect either vehicle personally that was involved in this accident, is that correct?
That is correct.
And you know that the Puris still own the Mercedes that was involved in the impact, correct?
I believe so, yes.
Dr. Blazek, I believe you testified earlier that you have a Ph.D. in biomechanical engineering. Is that correct?
That is not correct. My PhD is in mechanical engineering.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Based on your experience and your offer of testimony today as a biomechanical expert in this case, would you agree that the field of biomechanics involves the application of mechanical principles to biological symptoms?
To biological systems? Yes,
Correct.
that's one of the definitions of biomechanics.
And in this case, in Ms. Puri's case, the biological system we would be looking at would be the movement of Ms. Puri's body at the time of the impact. Is that correct?
Well, it depends on what question you're asking. The biological system is her in a general sense, and then we can look at various parts of her body to investigate various injury mechanisms for those parts of her body.
And as it relates to any head injury, I believe you said you cannot determine a mechanism of injury, correct?
as we talked about before, in my mind, there's two parts of the mechanism for injury. We can determine the first part, which is the head acceleration that her head would have sustained. But in terms of giving a tolerance or a threshold above which she would have sustained a concussion, or there would be a mechanism for her to sustain a concussion, that we don't have the literature to support.
So then, would you agree with me that property damage alone is not a valid predictor of acute injury following an accident?
Here, I think as a general statement, that is true, but there's a lot of different variables, different accidents that you're talking about, different types of injuries. So broadly speaking, I think you would be correct, but there's lots of exceptions to that rule.
Would you agree that property damage alone is not a valid predictor of potential for chronic injury following an accident?
I would give the same answer.
Okay, and then same question, would you agree with me that property damage alone is not a valid predictor of symptom duration following injury after an accident?
I would give the same answer.
Okay, and so is it your testimony that as part of your expert work as a biomechanic and accident reconstruction effort, you look at property damage to assist you in determining whether an injury was sustained by a person in one of your cases?
Well, so I never determine whether somebody sustained an injury or not. That is a medical opinion that I don't give. But I certainly do give opinions about the mechanisms of injury. And the damage to the vehicles involved in an accident is certainly one of the things that I look at in order to evaluate the type of collision and the severity of the collision. That's really one of the pillars of the accident reconstruction work that I do, is we look at the photos of the damage to the vehicles, we look at the repair estimates, we look at them in person, we evaluate the damage to the vehicles as one of the ways to reconstruct the accident. And then once we've reconstructed the accident, that then gives us an input into the biomechanics analysis. So certainly, in my analysis of mechanisms of injury, I certainly look at the property damage of the vehicles.
And you look at the property damage to determine the forces involved in the impact, is that correct?
That's part of the analysis, sure.
And when you calculate these forces as part of your biomechanical analysis, do you then compare those forces involved in an accident to a plaintiff in a case's personal tolerance?
Well, we typically don't have the personal tolerance for any particular person unless we can put them in some kind of test environment. But what we do is we compare them to the tolerance data for that particular group of people, or a group of people that is similar in the things that we think are important. So for example, if we are looking at somebody who has a broken leg, we would look at the fracture tolerance of the femur in people who are similar to that particular person in gender, maybe in size, and maybe similar to them in age.
Deployable headrests are considered a safety feature, is that correct, Dr. Blazek?
I'm not really sure how you
Objection
would.
beyond the scope of Dr. Blazek's expertise.
I'm not really sure what would be a safety feature. Headrests in general, one of their functions is to control the movement of the head.
Control the movement of the head in order to minimize forces upon the head at the time of impact, is that correct?
Well, here you'd have to look at what each specific manufacturer is trying to achieve with their headrest. Broadly speaking, headrests in rear end collisions are designed to more minimize the movement of the head to protect or to reduce the range of motion of the neck. However, headrests have lots of other uses besides just in protecting the head or the neck in rear end collisions.
Are you aware of any peer-reviewed studies or publications that indicate that deployable headrests actually increase head accelerations and impacts?
I am not.
And you indicated when speaking with Mr. Roach a few moments ago that you have referenced as part of your analysis in this case, one IIHS test that indicates that the deployable headrest may have increased the head peak acceleration. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And okay. Okay, Dr. Blazek, those are all my questions. Thank you.
Very briefly, I just have a little bit of follow-up. You testified that you haven't witnessed car crash studies. You haven't authored any studies involving the brain or the neck, and that you didn't know where Miss Peary's hands were. My question to you is, if you had witnessed crash studies and authored studies regarding the brain and neck, and you did know where Miss Peary's hands were, would that alter your conclusion regarding the forces in this collision, that there was a delta V somewhere between 6 to 7 miles per hour, and that Miss Peary's peak head acceleration would be between 12 and 20 Gs?
Relax Foundation and misstates Dr. Blazek's prior testimony.
The position of Miss Peary's hands in this particular case doesn't really matter because the studies show that at this severity of rear end collisions, the hands come off the steering wheel. So they don't serve to mitigate the movement of the upper body, especially in people who are unaware, which or the impending collision, which Miss Peary was. In terms of physically attending or witnessing collisions, I don't really see how that would influence or improve my ability to analyze this particular accident. I've certainly read the relevant literature for both the reconstruction and the biomechanics of rear-end collisions similar to this. I've looked at crash tests. I looked at the specific tests for the seats in this specific case. So I feel that I have all the relevant information I need in order to support the opinions I have. And witnessing a car crash of some type would not really affect my opinions here.
Thank you. You testified that there's two parts to a mechanism of injury analysis. The first part is determining the forces and the peak head acceleration. And the second part is taking that information and doing an analysis of whether or not those forces are consistent with the threshold for concussion. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's correct.
And so you don't disagree.
I would
sorry.
disagree. Instead of forces, I would say accelerations.
Thank you. And that's much more precise in my question. Now, you don't disagree with the respondent's expert, Brian Doherty, regarding the first half of that mechanism of injury with a delta V in the range of 6 to 7 and peak head acceleration in the range of 12 to 20 Gs, right?
Yes, our analyses in this case are very similar.
But you do disagree with Dr. Doherty in applying those forces to the literature. And my understanding is that the data does not exist about tolerance for concussion with a woman of Miss Peary's age and size, because it would be unethical to create that data by exposing a woman of Miss Peary's gender, size, and age to head trauma. Is that correct?
I would state it just slightly differently, which is I think the literature is not applicable to Miss Peary, in that the literature is it's based on a very specific population. Ultimately, the literature gives us a statistical model, which gives us a statistical percentage of concussion at various acceleration or various peak head acceleration levels. But you always have to keep in mind what group is the statistical model based on. And in this particular case, the group that the statistical models are based on is so very different from Miss Peary that it's comparing apples to oranges. And we don't have the data that would be of people similar to Miss Peary, because as you point out, we just don't have the ability to systematically expose people like Miss Peary to head trauma and then measure whether they have a concussion or not.
And in fact, part of your job with Insight Tech is reviewing the biomechanical literature, correct?
That's correct.
And really your only disagreement with Dr. Doherty is applying not the forces, but the acceleration to the literature, right?
Exactly.
Objection outside of the scope of the cross-examination.
One of the things that we as biomechanics experts bring to the table is that we are conversant with the literature and we understand what the literature says, and we can then explain how to apply the literature to a particular case. And sometimes that means that we say, well, based on the literature, the tolerance is something, and then we can apply it to a particular person. But sometimes our job is to simply say, biomechanics doesn't yet have that data. And so we just don't know. We don't have a scientific basis to make a statement about a particular person and a particular mechanism of injury.
Would it be unfair to compare Miss Peary, a petite 50-something-year-old woman, to an active young male football player?
Objection outside of the scope of the cross-examination.
One of the in the realm of head tolerance, certainly, because when we look at the mechanical tolerance of the head, one of the things that we see is that it decreases with age. And so there's a significant age gap between a 20-something football player and Miss Peary. There's also a difference in gender and in size, but in my mind, the age gap is really the most important difference between the two.
Thank you, Dr. Blazek. I have nothing further.
I believe we're all done. Is there any more questions for the witness?
Anything further, Ms. Barcina?
Oh, no, we're good.
Okay, thank you. We are concluding today's deposition of Katerina Blazek. The time now is 10:51 a.m. We're off the record.